All right, we're going to see if we can do this. So today we're going to be running through the OPS personality system, and we're going to try to do it in the simplest way you can because it's a system with 2,000 personality types, which is a lot of types. So we're going to start out with the modalities because there's only 4 of them, right? And the way we talk about the modalities is we just have, there's like a 2-letter summary, and then there's a word that's like a buzzword that we use. So we've got like this stands for double feminine, and then we've got like the buzzword, which is tester, right? And then that first F that you see stands for feminine sensory. So it could be SE or SI, and that's just your sensing-based perception function, which could be masculine or feminine, but in the tester, it's feminine, right? And then that second one is going to be the DE, and the DE is the decider function, which we'll kind of cover those a little bit later. But the decider function is like going to be either reasons or values, and it's just sort of how you make decisions. And the extroverted one is what you see in the modality. So that extroverted function can be either feminine or masculine, and that's what gives us these 4 modality types. And this is kind of like weird because it's not symmetrical, right? Because it's always DE, as you can see, but then the sensory, it could be SE or SI. It's just whichever version, right? So it's like it's linked to the sensory aspect, not the decider aspect, right? Because it's always the extroverted decider function, which means it could be TE or it could be FE. But in the case of sensation, it's always going to be the sensing function, whether it's introverted or extroverted. So you've got the tester type, which has feminine sensory and feminine extroverted decider, or DE. And then you've got the visual, which is FM, and that's with feminine sensory plus masculine DE. And then you've got audio, which is masculine sensory plus feminine DE. And then you've got the kinesthetic, which is masculine sensory and masculine DE. And then down here, we just have like a quick little, the sensory modality is in the first slot. And then the DE modality is in the second slot. And the reason I pulled these out is because there's only 4 of them. You can just visually see there's 4 options here. And these 4 options apply to every type. So these modalities don't affect and are not affected by the rest of your type. So it's an easy thing. It's like algebraically, you can pull out modality and say, okay, just understand this. It's simple, and there's 4 options, and those 4 options can apply to any type. Next, we have quadra. And quadra is the same type of thing. There's 4 options, and those 4 options can apply to any type. And what that means is that any one of those previous 4 modalities could be any of these 4 quadras, which means we now have 16 types, right? And we can run through the quadras really quickly because we've got alpha quadra, which is just going to be TIFE and SINE. And that little arrow there just means that it's an axis. Because the way the logic works, if you have introverted thinking, you're going to have extroverted feeling. And the reason for that is because thinking or reasons and feeling or values is basically it's like on a seesaw, And if you're dominated by one of those in an extroverted way, then that makes the other one end up introverted and vice versa. So that's why there's that arrow. We call that an axis. And that means that an alpha quadra type could be savior TI or savior FE, right? Like either one of those could be first. But the point is that they are TIFE in whatever order, as opposed to being TEFI, for example, right? Because that's the other option, right? Your thinking could be introverted or extroverted. Like everyone does thinking, it's just, is it introverted or is it extroverted? Same thing with feeling. Everyone operates based on values to some extent. It's just, are they looking at a spectrum of values, or are they stacking their own values, right? And so that's what the axes are. And you've got these, thinking and feeling, reasons and values. That's like a decider axis. And then you've got sensing and intuition, which is like the observer axes, right? And if you combine those two, if you have a deciding axis and an observing axis, you end up with all four functions, right? And those personality types that have those four functions in them, in whatever order they do, are in alpha quadra. And then you've got the beta quadra, which keeps that TI, FE from the alpha quadra, but now we've got SE and NI. So we just flip the kind of the charges, if you will, on the sensing and intuition. And then we get gamma, which then switches both, right? So now we have extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking. And then we switch to delta, and now we have extroverted thinking, but introverted sensing, right? And because these are an axis, you don't have to say both, because saying that someone has SI means they also have NE and vice versa, right? So those are the four quadras. So just to review, if you think about the modalities from earlier, we described the modality types as like the double feminine type, which was the tester. They were described as having feminine sensory and feminine DE. Now that DE stood for extroverted deciding function. So you can just probably intuit what that means. But these are the deciding functions, the T and the F. And then the extroverted decider, the DE, is just going to be whichever one of those is extroverted. So a tester type, a double feminine type, is going to have, if they're in the alpha quadra, they're going to have feminine FE, because that's the extroverted decider, and they're going to have feminine SI, because that's the sensing function. If a tester is in the beta quadra, they'll have feminine FE, because that's the extroverted decider, but then they will have feminine SE, because now in the beta quadra, the sensing function is extroverted, but it's still the sensing function, right? Now, if we switch to gamma quadra, they're going to have feminine SE if they're a tester. If they're double feminine, right? They're going to have feminine sensory, feminine SE, but now they're going to have feminine TE, because the extroverted decider is now a thinking function, a reasoning function, as opposed to a values-based function. And if we carry that logic along, in the delta quadra, someone who is a tester type, a double feminine type, is going to have feminine thinking and feminine SI, right? And you can kind of like do the math on your own. But again, the reason I'm separating out quadra and modality is because any of these quadras can be any of those four modalities, which means once you understand these two concepts that I've showed you, modality and quadra, you can just multiply them by each other and end up with 16 types, which is like a quick and easy way of getting to 16 types. And later I'll show you another way of thinking about it, which is you can divide the total number of types by quadra. Like you can remove quadra from the equation, and now you have 4 times fewer types to think about, because 2,000 types is a lot of types. If you can divide it by 4 and then you only have 512 types, you want to do that as much as you can to simplify, right? So quadra and modality are nice, simple concepts that are good to get under your belt, just to make the meat of the system easier to digest. Here's the next concept. This is a newer one, and I'm not going to go into as much detail with this. This is what brings us from 512 up to 2048 types, and if it weren't for socials, we would only have 512 types, which is more manageable. But the concept here is just, these words can kind of be changed around sometimes, but the idea behind flex is this idea of trying to be at the top, internal drive, internal motivation, competitiveness, responsibility, like a lot of energy coming from inside, very self-motivated. It can look IJ-like, you can get into a lot of weeds with like how the details, but it's that sort of concept. And then they just give a straight list of like what order the rest of the socials fall under. But the main thing just to know is that, it's like the number one or it's flex, and that's one of the social types. And the other social types are here. And the other important thing to know is that there's also 4 socials, and they're also completely separate from the other aspects of personality, which means we now have 16 times 4 socials. We now have 64 types, basically. And we've just done it with three very simple concepts that just have 4 options. And the nice thing about these 3 concepts is that they don't interact with each other. They're completely independent, right? So you can really internalize these, and they're not going to mess you up. You're not going to have to like destroy your understanding as you link new things to it. It's just going to work, right? This order is kind of interesting. You can notice this order might help when you start thinking about cognitive functions, just because you can notice that like flex, it's like number 1 first and then number 4 last. And then generalize, you have number 2 first and you have number 3 last. So this first number is the number that represents it, and then the numbers after it are just the order that the other ones relate to it in. So generalize is number 2, flex is number 1, specialize is number 3, and friends is number 4. And so when you have like, if you're friends, you're number 4, and your last one is going to be flex, right? And then your second one is going to be specialize, right? So you can kind of read this as your friends first, and then your specialize, then your generalize, and then your flex last. And you can notice a pattern, because if you're 4 first, then you're 1 last. And if you're 1 last, you're 4, sorry. And if you're 1 first, then you're 4 last. And the same thing with generalize. If you're 2 first, then you're 3 last, and you have 4 and 1 in the middle. And if you're 3 first, then you're 2 last, and you have 1 and 4 in the middle, right? So it's that same concept going on. So it's kind of a pattern there. You can kind of look at it, kind of make sense of it. It's just friends and flex are supposed to be in opposition, and generalize and specialize are also supposed to be in opposition, because flex is all about kind of being at the top, being the best, being internally motivated and driven, and friends is all being externally motivated and externally driven, and prioritizing harmony and kind of community type stuff, right? So you can kind of see why those are in opposition. And then at the same time, generalize and specialize are also in opposition, because generalize is all about sort of broadening, and like going a lot of different directions and taking on a lot of responsibility, versus specialize, which is really doubling down on one area and getting the details right. So that's the concept of socials. And with this concept, we now have 64 types, and it's like all nicely organized. They're all separate, it's great. But OPS doesn't just have 64 types. We actually have, that's the wrong slide. Here we go. We actually have 2,000 types, right? So we're going to take the 2,000 OPS types and we're going to divide it by the 4 modalities. Now we only have 512 types, because the modalities are pretty simple, We had the double feminine tester. We had the audio, which is MF audio, right? And then we had the FM, which is visual. And then we have double masculine, which is kinesthetic. So there's 4 modalities, right? And you can take those 2,048 types, and 25% of them are testers, 25% of them are visuals, 25% of them are double masculine, 25% of them are MF. And so if you kind of take those modalities out of the equation, you only have 512 types. And then you can take those 512 and you can say, of each of those 4 groups of 512 personalities, there are an equal part of them that are each of the quadras, right? So again, 1/4 of them are going to be alpha quadra, 1/4 of them are going to be beta quadra, another quarter are going to be gamma, and so on. And so if you remove the quadras from your number of types, you divide 512 by 4, and you get 128 types. So it's even simpler. We're basically just doing algebra, you know? We're taking this 2,000 types, which is big and scary, and we're taking out the concepts that don't affect each other, you know? And we're getting rid of them so that we can see, you know, we're isolating the complex variable. You know, we're separating out the simple parts. And then the last step, we have our 128 types because we pulled out the 4 modalities and the 4 quadras. And now we pull out the 4 socials, the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, and the number 4. And now we end up with only 32 types. Hurrah, right? So we've gone from 2,000 types to 32 types. And all you have to do is understand the socials, which is pretty simple. There's just 4 options. The quadra, again, very simple, only 4 options. And your modalities, which again are extremely simple. It's really good to get a handle on those 3 concepts because then you only have to think about 32 types. And when thinking about those 32 types, there's a little bit of vocabulary. Here is the vocabulary that we need. So, so this little diagram here is exactly what you need to understand the types. Because if you look at this diagram, there's actually 32 types around the edges here. And those 32 types are the final piece to OPS. So once you understand these 32 types, you understand all of OPS. And the vocabulary you need to understand these types is just written out here on the screen for you. So you can just kind of reference that. And you might have to like kind of pause the video. I might do this. So if you want to take a screenshot, you can take a nice clean screenshot. But yeah, so here's this, and I'll kind of run through it. So first off, at the top there, we've got that list of the functions, which is just showing you why we have OI and DE written here on the circle. That is to accommodate for the quadras, because any quadra can be DI, OI, right? Because we're not saying whether or not it's SI or SE or NI, you know? Like with DI, sorry. So any quadra, for example, like here, if we're looking at the OI, DI, any quadra could be OI. It's just a question of if they have SI or NI, right? And any quadra could be DI. It's just a question of if they have FI or TI. So by writing observer and decider instead of sensing, intuition versus thinking and feeling, we're actually making this more flexible, basically, right? And so that's why that's what this internal ring is. You can just think of this as representing the letter there, observer, just means we're talking about sensing or intuition. And the letter here, the D, just means we're talking about thinking or feeling, right? And then if you look at the very bottom there where it says animals down here, you can see that sleep is going to be OI plus DI. And that's what we have here on the second ring. We have like this S stands for sleep and the B stands for blast. This P here stands for play, and this C stands for consume. So that's what this ring is. This ring just represents the animals. And you can kind of see here that consume, like as an animal, is centered, like the types, these types on the outside, that's showing what order they have the animals in. And you can see the first one is in bold because there's a lot of consume in those types. And you can see that that's where the consume is focused on this ring. And you can see that on this ring, which is function activation, that's one you really want to keep track of because I didn't write it down here, but this internal ring represents function activation, which just means that any of these types, for example, in this triangle, right, this little slice of the pie, any of these types are going to have highly activated OE and highly activated DI. And that OE, DI, if you look over here for OEDI, that's consume, right? So if you have those functions activated, strongly, then you could have it OEDI or DIOE, but either way, you're going to have consume pretty strongly activated. And if you look above these two activations, every single one of these types around the outer ring, which is just it's just a animal stack. It's just the order that you have the animals in. There's 4 of them, and they can be in a variety of orders. And it looks like there's 32 different orders, but there's actually only 16. The reason that we have 2 different versions of each order, like here you can see it's like play, consume, sleep, blast, and then play, consume, sleep, blast. The reason there's 2 versions is because of the human needs, which are here. And the human need just means what your first function is, right? And that's pretty intuitive because play is OE plus DE, and then the human need of EJ, their first function here is going to be DE, right? So their first function is in play, so it makes sense, that they're going to be all in one line, right? Because this is one type, right? They are play, consume, sleep, blast. They are an EJ as opposed to an EP. They're save your play. Both of these are save your play, right? The difference is the EJ is going to be DEOE, and the EP is going to be OEDE, right? But they both have play as their first animal, which you can see here. Now, the C is in bold. And the reason for that is because they have what we call double activated consume. And that sounds like a complicated concept, but there's 2 ways we can think about it. The first way we can think about it is on this internal ring, which represents activation, we see OE and DI, which is consume. So anything above this is going to have double activated consume. If it was a different type, like for example here, this section we have OI and DE. And if you look for OI and DE down here, you'll see OI and DE represents blast. And every type above this is going to have double activated blast, right? So now you can see the connection between the activation of the functions and the bold animal. And it's interesting and sort of noteworthy because it's not always the first animal. So let's go back to the first one, the original one where we were. I think it's easier to read here. But if you're an EP, we're talking about you. Yeah, so the thing here is you'll notice that the first animal is sometimes in bold, but sometimes it's the second animal. And the reason for that is it has to do with the second 2 animals, or like the first 3 animals. You could also think of it as the last animal. It's kind of either way. I'll explain both. So if you think of it in terms of the first 3 animals, you have consume, which is OEDI. Then you have play, which is OEDE. Then you have blast, which is OIDE. And so that blast has DE in it, and that consume has OE in it. And then the play is OE plus DE. So in those first 3 animals, we actually hit play twice, right? Because we hit OE with the consume once, then we hit play and we hit OE twice, then we hit DE for the first time, and then with blast, we hit DE for the second time, right? So what that's showing is that the play functions are actually getting pinged, if you will, 2 times instead of 1 time. And then that last animal here, like sleep last, those functions basically only get pinged once by the top 3, and then they get their second ping at the very end, right? So they're a lot weaker. And that's why they're in parentheses. The last animal is always in parentheses. And the last animal might be an easier way to think about what animal you have double activated or in bold. because it's really just the opposite of your last animal. So if your last animal is sleep, which is OI plus DI, then your double activated animal is going to be play, OE plus DE, right? So that explains that concept. And then I think there's only like a few things we can cover. We can cover some idiosyncrasies with the savior animal here and some idiosyncrasies with the human need, because like it's perfectly symmetrical, but it's maybe a little unexpected that we have some way over here, you know. And we can also talk a little bit about the organization of the animal stacks here on the outer ring, because they're nicely organized. They're very, very nicely organized. Alrighty. So when it comes to these animal stacks, they're basically organized in such a way that the double activated animal is together, right? So everything, you know, if we think of double activated play, here it's blast, here it switches to play, and everything with double activated play is all right there in those 8 types. And then if we look at consume, all the double activated consumes, those are all together, you know, and it just goes all the way around. Here we have double activated sleep, and then here we have double activated blast, right? So that's kind of nice. And then something else to keep in mind is that like this ring, which represents the human needs, has a lot of variance in it, right? So if you're an EP, what that means, like someone who's an EP over here, what that means is that they are going to either have OEDI as savior functions, or they're going to have OEDE as savior functions. And it's important to note that there's a difference between savior functions, which are what are listed here. These are the savior function possibilities for each human need. And those are different from function activations, because the function activations come from the animal stack, but the savior functions come from the function stack. And that's something we can dive into at a different time, but basically every type is going to have a function stack and an animal stack. And in OPS specifically, the animal stack is more important, which is why it's here. And the function stack is not super important other than those first 2 functions. Those first 2 functions are emphasized a lot, so that's why I wrote them out here for you. IPs are going to have DIOE or DIOI, because an IP type is always going to be either savior consume here, because DI and OE are in consume. They can be in any order for consume, right? They can be in any order. So they could be OEDI or DIOE, and it's still consume, because consume is just when you are using OE and DI at the same time. The reason here that we have this dash is because an IP is going to be DI first, always. Every single IP is going to be DI. But some of them are going to be DIOI, and others are going to be DIOE. And that is in the functions, right? That's in their function stack, not the animal stack. Because in the animal stack, each one of these animals is actually going to be sort of pinging 2 functions, right? And because of that, you get, you know, the first 2 animals ping 3 functions, but we're not going to say you have 3 savior functions. You know, you only have 2 because you have 4 functions in your type, and you have 4 animals in your type. And because everything's split down the middle, 2 of your animals are going to be savior animals that you use more than your daemons, and 2 of your functions are going to be savior functions that you use more than your daemons, right? So this function activation comes from just doing a tiny bit of math with the first 3 animals to see which 2 functions you're pinging the most. And yeah, so I guess now we can get into some of the fun stuff, because this is something you can just read. Like once you know this vocabulary and once you understand how it's organized, you can use this to just literally you can read this diagram, which is amazing, you know? Like if you want to see, we can say what type has the most cranked up sleep, the strongest sleep. And we can go, oh, well, sleep is going to be on this ring, so we can just look for that. And then we can just center it on sleep as a concept. And I know it's really hard to see this. This dark purple is IJ. And now we can see that sleep, which is DIOI or OIDI, like that distinction is interesting. Okay, we can say, I wonder what that is. And then you can just kind of read it and you can see, oh yeah, if I look at my human needs, IP is always going to be savior DI. And I can see that the IPs are on the DI side, right? There's more IPs on the DI side, and on the IJ side, right? That's the OI side. There's more IJs over here. There's still an IP on the OI side, and there's still an IJ on the DI side, but there's only 1 versus 2, right? So we can start to see that function activation and the human needs kind of overlap a little bit, right? Because you can see that sleep is kind of an IJ or an IP thing, you know, like we can see that all of the types that have the strongest activation of the sleep animal are either IPs or IJs, right? But it's not all of them because OPS is very flexible. We do have an EJ over here, which actually has sleep in bold, which means they actually have double activated OI and DI, which is impressive for an EJ because an EJ has a savior function of DE. And these are like the really interesting edge case types, right? And you can see that there's a bunch of them, you know, like every single human need has one that's out on the outlier. And there's an introverted one and there's an extroverted one, right? Like if we look at the IP, for example, you know, an IP in the human needs is going to be DI, but there's an IP way over here that has double activated blast, which means it's an IP who is savior DI, but they actually have double activated DE. And if you look at this, they're consume last. Consume is OEDI, which means they only have, the only animal that activates their DI as a savior is their sleep. They get the DI activated once, but they get that DE activated by their blast and their play before they get to the consume. It might be a little confusing that the third animal activates, you know, the DE a second time, but you can think of it less as that third animal is activating in a savior state, and you can think of it more as that consume last, like never happens, right? So you can think of the consume last as just a giant negative on that half of the DI, because sleep and consume both use DI. They're the only 2 animals that use DI. And even though sleep is their savior animal, which hits the DI, and they're an IP, which also hits the DI, they are consume last, which means the DI is not going to be coming up as much as the DE that is in the blast that gets hit by the play before the consume, right? So that's an interesting thing, you know. Here's an IP who is very blast-like. They are savior sleep. We can see that here, but they've got a lot of DE in them. Their DE is very powerfully activated. They've got double activated blast, right? So that's an interesting IP. Then over here, you've got an interesting EJ because they've got double activated sleep. EJs are normally going to be savior DE, but this EJ, even though of course they are savior DE, because all EJs are savior DE, but they have double activated sleep, which means they have double activated OI and double activated DI. So this is a really interesting EJ. It's the most introverted EJ. Here's your animal stack. If you want to, think about that. This is the most introverted EJ that exists, right? Then you could go over here and you could find the most extroverted EJ, right? This one here. And what's that going to have? Oh, look, they have double activated play, which means their OE is actually activated more strongly than their DE, which is weird because as an EJ, DE is their first function in their function stack. But in their function activation, the OE is activated more strongly. Oh, and I actually did this wrong, because this isn't the weirdest one. This is like this is an extroverted one, but it's not the most extroverted. Here's the most extroverted. It's over here because it's DI actually. Double activated consume. Yeah, that was a silly mistake of me to make, because double activated consume, that's even more wild as an EJ, because they have double activated DI even though the EJ has DE, right? DE and DI are opposites versus just being savior OE versus being savior DE and having double activated OE, right? So there's like two levels of weird, I guess, you know. There's like one that has one of them has sort of, well, this one is still DE, right? If you look at EJ, this guy is still double activated blast, but they have double activated OI now. That's interesting. But yeah, kind of fun to read this. All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that was helpful. I know there's a lot of information in there. It's definitely something you can kind of run over a few times. I'll try to, I think if you want to find out a lot more about all these individual pieces, you can look up Objective Personality on YouTube, and I can put a link towards Objective Personality in the description. They have a lot of little short videos explaining each of these concepts in more detail, but they don't have any video that explains everything the way I have here. So this can give you a little bit of a grounding, even though it's a lot of information, and hopefully going back and forth, you can kind of get a good idea for the system. So anyway, that's it for now. Feel free to ask any questions, things you want clarified. I know I ran through a lot. I'm not sure how clearly it was presented, but I can always make more videos clarifying concepts or diving into more depth of certain things. So please give your feedback in the comment section. Thank you for watching, and have a good rest of your day.